Welcome to my presentation, Make America Great Again, for real this time. So for the project, we were tasked with choosing a developing nation, figuring out how to make it developed. For my project, I decided to choose America, which may seem surprising to some of you, seeing how, in most cases, people consider America to be a developed nation. But when looking at it, most people and some articles say that we are actually the least developed of any developed nation. Now you might think of, well, what are some of the reasons? In this project, I decided that poverty, health, infrastructure, and school or education were all reasons to see us as a developed nation. So, what is a developed nation? Following World War II, there was a discovery of mass poverty in non-Western countries. And for most definitions, the idea is any country with a low per capita income, little to no infrastructure, poor health, hunger, anything like that considers it a developing nation. The UN defines it as any country lacking in per capita income and human assets, which are indications of nutrition, health, school enrollment, and literacy. So, America. Uh, if you look back at the history of development, we have pretty much always been there. Following World War II, Truman even made a speech talking about making our progress available for the rest of the world. And we'll see this from the fact that when looking at any of the donors within the world, we are always pretty much up there. If you look at the map on the right side, you can see just how much we've given different countries. If you look at Afghanistan, 5.1 billion, Iraq, 5.3, Kenya, 1.1. Even our private sector development is usually up there. Bill and Melinda Gates, who most people know as the founder and former CEO of Microsoft, are actually number 3 in overall development aid, right behind the United States and United Nations. So, with all this, you probably assume that we're at the top of the list for developed nations. However, if you look at it, we're 13th overall. And in fact, in most areas looked at, we're not first. We're actually 114th in the least peaceful countries in the world. The Global Peace Index in 2017 noted that the past year has been a deeply worrying one for the U.S. The presidential campaign highlighting the deep divisions within American society. Accordingly, the score for intensity or organized internal conflict has worsened. Data has also shown a declining level of trust in government and other citizens, which has generated a deterioration in the score for level of perceived criminality in society. And the main contributing factor actually to America's high violence is its continued high levels of expenditure on military and heavy weaponry, which I will cover later on. So, what are our problem areas, and are we a developed nation? The economy. Poverty. Poverty is defined as a pervasive human condition of being unable to obtain or provide a standard level of food, water, and or shelter. It exists in every country in varying degrees, and it is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Now, the United States is considered the richest country in the world, and yet millions of its residents live in poverty. And actually, according to the US Census Bureau, 2011, the current population reports that 46.2 million Americans are considered impoverished, which is 15% of the country's population, and of that, approximately 16.4 million of them are children, 22% of the population younger than 18, and of those 65 and older, it's 8.7%. Now, in the late 1950s, the rate was approximately 22%, which just shy of 40 million Americans. After that, the rate actually declined steadily, reaching a low of 11.1% in 1973. There are reasons for that, which I will cover later. And then it was rising to a high of nearly 15% 3 times in 1983, 93, and 2001. However, the 46.2 million that we see now is actually the most ever recorded. If you look at the graph on the right, that actually shows the poverty level of America compared to other industrialized nations or other developed nations. And you'll see that ours is a lot higher, and in most cases, it's actually because other countries help their poor. The graph at the bottom actually shows that. It shows the income of the poor and working class in the United States compared to both Canada and Norway at different percentiles within the country. On top of everything else, our wages are stagnant. There have been some reports that show that pretty much since the 70s, while inflation has increased, wages have not compared. If you look at, I think the most cited one is the fact that any college-age person in the 70s and 80s could actually pay for college with just a regular 9-to-5 job, or even just part-time, whereas now you have to work well over 40 hours a week just to pay for that. And probably the worst part is the wealth inequalities. The top 1% in America earns on average $1.3 million a year. The bottom 50% of the American population earned on average $16,000, which means that the 1% earns 81 times as much as the bottom 50, compared to 1980 when it was only 27 times more, which is still a lot. The income of the rich has increased much faster than the income of the bottom, and the U.S., which holds $63.5 trillion, or 41.6% of the world's private wealth, but it also has the largest wealth inequality gap of 55 countries studied. If you look at the Gini coefficient, which was established in 1912 to show the level of wealth inequality, we have a rating of 41.5. Now the scale is from 0 to 100, with actually 0 being the best, which means we do not have that great of a rating. Many other countries, including Sweden, Thailand, and Bangladesh, have better ratings. And actually, another study showed that if you were to do it not based off of income but wealth, the coefficient would actually be 86.5. So, and other sources of income are included. The United States is by far the most unequal of all of the top 18 most developed countries. Next. Infrastructure. Now, if anyone's ever, well, I guess just driven around on any of the roads, I think there's a joke that goes, in Britain, people drive on the left side of the road, and people in New York drive on what's left of the road. So the infrastructure is slowly crumbling and is in desperate need of repair. A study showed that we actually need about a $3.6 trillion investment over the next 6 years. There's actually a fact that says that in New York City, the development of the 2nd Avenue subway line was delayed by the outbreak of World War II, and it actually is still not finished. In South Dakota, Alaska, and Pennsylvania, water is still transported via century-old wooden pipes, and actually 45% of Americans lack access to public transit. In fact, actually, where I live, there is no access to public transport unless you call, I guess, an Uber or a Lyft, which I don't believe that actually counts. Large portions of U.S. waterway capacity are more than half a century old, and in Detroit, some of the sewer lines date back to the mid-19th century. 1 in 9 of the U.S. bridges, which is actually over 66,000, are considered structurally deficient. There was actually, I believe, in Syracuse, one collapsed. All this means that the U.S. has fallen rapidly in international rankings of infrastructure. Most people do not have access to high-speed transport. In fact, the high-speed transportation from San Francisco to Los Angeles was actually just scrapped. There's no high-speed internet. As I mentioned, just look at the water in Flint, Michigan. Most of it was due to corroding pipes and other parts of the infrastructure. Recent international studies found that high-speed rail is actually critical to improving a country's economy, boosting productivity, and increasing mobility. The fastest train in the U.S. at this time is Amtrak's Acela Express, which averages only 68 miles per hour, while in Japan, France, China, South Korea, Spain, Italy, Germany, Belgium, and Italy, all the trains are regularly pushing 150 miles per hour. So our infrastructure is definitely in need of an up. Health, probably one of the biggest indicators of a developed nation. Rolling Stone recently published an article that said the U.S. is the only developed country that does not guarantee health care to its citizens. And if you look at the figure 15 on the right side of the page, you'll see that when it comes to health expenditures, we definitely far exceed most every other country. Even after the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, millions of poor Americans still remained without insurance, mostly because governors refused to expand Medicaid. It's a unique, America is unique among developed countries in that tens of thousands of poor Americans die because of the fact that we lack in health insurance. Even though we spend more than twice as much of our GDP on health care than the average for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a collection of rich world countries. Again, I point back to figure 15 to show just how much more we spend. And again, we do not have a system for free healthcare. The US spends about 3 times as much per capita on healthcare expenditures than the other countries with comparable incomes. We also lead wealthy countries in preventable deaths. In 2013, 112 out of every 100,000 Americans under 75 died from complications or conditions that could have been avoided with better health care. Almost 50 million Americans are without insurance, creating a burden on hospital emergency rooms and forcing people who need services into deep debt. Too few take advantage of primary care. They found out that the health of those in the US still trails behind that of people in developed countries around the world. A study showed that when people were asked if they had 2 or more chronic health conditions, 28% of US participants said they did, more than any other country. They were also among the most likely to say that health affected their ability to work full-time or perform daily activities. People in the US also reported more problems affording health care than any other country. 33% said they had a cost-related access problem to medical care within the past year. They were also more likely to say that they were always or usually worried about having enough money for rent and nutritious meals. We rank 26th in life expectancy around the world, with Japan leading the pack. Slide. Education. Again, if you go back to the UN's definition, education is one of the biggest indicators of developing nation. Being able to make sure that the youngest among us are able to have a better life. So, how do US students compare with their peers around the world? Recent studies have found that the US students continue to rank around the middle of the pack behind many other advanced industrial nations. The most recent PISA results from 2015 placed the US an unimpressive 38th out of 71 countries in math and 24th in science among the 35 members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation Development, which sponsors the PISA initiative. The US ranks 30 in math and 19th in science. You'll also find that our schools are funded locally rather than nationally, which means that actually the education system is plagued with structural racial biases, because this means that in poor neighborhoods, which usually are neighborhoods with people of color, their schools get less money because their citizens make less money. If you look at the image on the page, you'll see that it shows the different hurdles that people of color or low income status are likely to see during their time in school. Furthermore, we have no free college like most other developed countries. The Department of Education has confirmed that schools with high concentrations of poor students also have lower levels of funding. We have the highest achievement gaps between high-income and low-income students, as measured by the OECD. Schools today are actually more racially segregated than in the 1970s. Like I mentioned, our higher education system is unique among developed nations in that it is funded almost entirely privately by debt, meaning to go to school we have to continue to go further and further into debt. I personally, well, now that I am going for my master's, I'm actually $57,000 in debt. However, some states are trying to rectify that. New York just passed one that said any SUNY or CUNY school will now be free for 2 or 4 years, as long as you're willing to stay in New York the same number of years after. Students in the average OECD country can expect about 7% of their college tuition to be publicly funded, while in the United States, only about 40% is publicly funded. The price of college tuition is becoming harder and harder for Americans to afford. Collectively now, Americans hold more than $1.3 trillion in student loan debt, which, as we all know, is quite a lot. So, is there a solution to all of these problems? Will we be able to be, I guess, considered a developed nation once again? Well, in my opinion, I think there are some more simple solutions. Like I mentioned before, if you remember, the poverty levels seem to be going down in around the 1970s. In my opinion, I believe a lot of that is because of the methods of Keynesian economics, which, as I mentioned, would probably not be, if we were to go back to this, it would not be our first brush with this method of economics. If you look back, the New Deal was considered to be one of them. The idea behind it is for the government to step in, or some people call it pump priming, in cases of a kind of failing economy. In most cases, the government lowers interest rates, and by doing so, it allows more people to borrow money. So I guess the perfect example would be the New Deal. If you look back, following the Great Depression, or I guess still during the Great Depression, FDR rolled out the New Deal, which was a giant government program. I believe there's actually a statistic that says during that time period, the U.S. government spent more money in those years than they did in all the years prior. The program looked at infrastructure, job creations. Once World War II broke out, obviously putting people to work building planes, tanks, guns, everything like that. So anyway, under this method, the government, like I mentioned, lowers interest rates, and the hope is that the central banks will then lower rates and private banks follow suit. These low interest rates mean people borrow more money to buy machines and invest in infrastructure. There's also the fiscal policy, which is deficit spending, meaning that the government spends more money than they take in. This again would be used for things like infrastructure, social services, education. Again, actually, during the New Deal, FDR built schools. My high school was actually one of them. And they actually they proved that the free markets do not spontaneously maximize human well-being. So while most people now believe in leaving markets up to themselves and they would fix everything, if you look at the current American economy, it's not working. In Europe, they took it one step further with actually a social democracy idea with their free healthcare and free school. So if the United States was to follow suit, instead of having their Keynesian militarism, as we saw it, where instead of following Europe's plan, which actually was FDR's, it was considered to be the second New Deal. Anyway, we decided just to keep investing in building up our defense instead of investing in our people. Now, under the Keynesian economics, when America was following it, we actually saw a wealth boost of about 3%. It was also the smallest gap in wealth inequality between upper and middle classes. I thought, a great quote from an article I found. The antidote, as prescribed by Temin, is likely a tough sell in today's political climate. Expanding education, updating infrastructure, forgiving mortgage, student loan debt, and overall working to boost social mobility for all Americans are bound to be seen as too liberal for many policymakers. Until the course is changed, he warns, the middle class will continue to fade and America will remain unsustainably divided. So, if we were to go back to this method, which I believe for the last 5 minutes I've been pronouncing wrong, I believe it's actually Keynesian. Anyway, if we were to go back to Keynesian economics, we would see at least if we follow the social democracy part of it, we would see a correction in our healthcare now, with people not having to worry about not being able to see the doctor. It would be covered by the government. Infrastructure programs could be put forward, which would also put people back to work. So we would see decreases in poverty, healthcare problems. If we follow the free education part as well, students wouldn't have to worry about paying for college, and all the infrastructure, the bridges, the roads could be fixed. I also figured there was one more way to fix everything, which was probably one of my favorite ideas of development, which is critical modernism. Uh, this one follows the idea that, well, first off, not to just throw out all ideas of development, but instead to correct the ones we have. In most cases, they see elites as bad. That's elites in any capacity, whether it be, I guess, politicians or people of education. Well, I guess not maybe education. It's more elites in the sense of those with power. Instead, they favor the views of the oppressed, which would be your common everyday citizen. So it's about, well, in a sense, as I point out in the last bullet point, radical democracy. It's seeing what the common everyday man thinks of as a solution. It's also based off evidence, things you can see around you. If you were to, again, look back to the 1970s when we were under Keynesian economics and you saw that growth was better and people were doing better, that's evidence that these rules and these regulations, they've worked for people. Again, under radical democracy, it champions direct popular control over all resources and institutions used and inhabited by people, from fields to forests, factories to family, allowing people to have more control over things around them. Because people, they know best how to operate and organize their institutions. How can someone thousands of miles away uh, be better at telling me what's best for me than what I am? Now, this does not necessarily mean uh, limited government. In fact, I think it could mean the opposite. means expanding the government in a sense so that people have more of a say. And it's about production to meet the needs of the poorest people. So if you go back to the idea of Keynesian social democracy, changing things so that the poorest among us can be helped. It's also about the idea that workers should not only participate in management research, but rather should be the managers and researchers. Again, back to this idea that people, the workers, the ones who are using these machines, know how these things work, how best to work all of this. So, with these being solutions,